Good morning, HI 101. I just said good morning and it's like 9 o'clock at night. So, yeah, that's not right. All right. So, we are going into the development of the Christian church. A lot of it is actually what Catholics believe, though. It's talking mainly about the Roman Catholic Church, but that is where Christianity originated from, from all the popes and all that stuff. So, for future reference for you guys, we're going over the terms list. We're going over pages 187 to 194 in the book. And then we're going over the terms that are given. So, we're just going to jump right in. We're going to try and make it a shorter video. I'm going to try and post it tonight. That way you have it for tomorrow. It is Tuesday, so I have a quiz on it probably tomorrow. My teacher hinted that there was probably going to be a quiz. So, anyways, so let's just jump right in. So, the first term you have to know is Augustine. So, Augustine, who he was. So, first, to understand, so Christianity in the 4th century became the predominant religion. So this is after all those persecutions that we had earlier. Became the predominant religion. So what happened was church fathers came to be. So a number of intellectuals in the early church who wrote in Latin profoundly influenced the development of Christian thought in the West. They came to be known as the Latin fathers of the Catholic Church. Like I said, the Catholic Church. They include Augustine, Jerome, Ambrose, and Gregory the Great. The last two are discussed in Church and State, and Pope Gregory the Great later in this chapter. So the most important one right now we're going to be talking about is Augustine. So St. Augustine, he was a saint. He was the most prominent of the Latin fathers. So just remember that he's the most prominent. His work provides one of the best examples of how Christian theologians used pagan culture in the service of Christianity. He was born in North Africa. So he had two famous works. One of them was the Confessions, and one of them was the City of God. So, written in 397, the Confessions was a self-portrait not of Augustine's worldly activities, but of history of a heart. An account of his own personal spiritual experiences, written to help others with their search. Augustine described how he struggled throughout his early life to find God until his 32nd year, until he was 32. He experienced a miraculous conversion. So, basically, the Confessions, one of his most famous works, is basically what he did as a kid, what he did as a teenager, what he did in his young adult life. He wasn't really, super Christian-like, I guess. But he made mistakes, and he's just telling us about those mistakes. That's why it's called the Confession. So he's confessing all the sins he did in his early life. Then the City of God was his other major work. It was a profound expression of Christian philosophy of government and history. In it, Augustine theorized on the ideal relations between two kinds of societies existing throughout time: the city of God and the city of the world. Those who loved God would be loyal to the city of God, whose ultimate location was the kingdom of heaven. Earthly society would always be insecure because of human beings' imperfect nature and inclination to violate God's commandments. And yet the city of the world was still necessary, for it was the duty of rulers to curb the depraved instincts of sinful humans and maintain the peace necessary for Christians. So basically, the city of God, it's just telling you the differences between the city of God and the city of the world, the beliefs of us going to heaven and the beliefs that we have here on earth. Another thing that he did was establish the Christian church's views on sexual desire. So they had this thing called celibacy. Most of you know what celibacy is. Just basically abstinence from sexual activity, so just not having sex. That's basically all it is. So most of them didn't get married. This is later on we're going to talk about monks and nuns, but they didn't get married, so they didn't practice any fornication of any type. So that was what celibacy meant. They basically thought it was like a fleshly desire, so basically they just cut it out of their lives entirely. Okay, so that's Augustine. That's a couple of things he instituted. He was the first church father, the first Latin father. And then we're going to get into the second guy, Jerome. So Jerome, he was another Latin father, but he was pursued in the literary studies. So he was very good with the book ways. So what he actually did was, apparently he had a dream in which Jesus appeared as his judge. And he said that he was more inclined with the books of, it says the books of the world instead of the book, like the Bible. So what ended up happening was, Jerome was determined to read the books of God more than to read the books of man. So basically read the Bible, know about the Bible. So this is on page 188. So what he ended up doing was, because he was a very good scholar, he was the greatest scholar out of all the Latin fathers, so that was very important. But because he was such a great scholar, he ended up, he had such a great knowledge of both Hebrew and Greek. He helped translate the Old and New Testament into Latin, and then this is your next term, the Latin Vulgate. So in the process, he created the Latin Vulgate, or common text of the scriptures, that became the standard edition for the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. So the Latin Vulgate ended up becoming the standard of what Roman Catholics actually used. So it was like the Bible, basically, back then. Because, it was in Hebrew and Greek. Old Testament was in Hebrew. New Testament was in Greek. And now they're changing it into Latin. So that's why if you're like a Bible major, you have to study Greek. And then you might have to study Hebrew, but you also have to study Latin. So then we're going to get into the next term, the Patrine supremacy. So they ended up having bishops. So the doctrine of Patrine supremacy, based on the belief that the bishops of Rome occupied a preeminent position in the church, was grounded in scripture. They say that Simon Peter, Saint Peter as they call him, Saint Peter was the first bishop, and that basically Jesus had given the keys to the kingdom of heaven to Peter, who was considered the chief apostle and the first bishop of Rome. Bishops of Rome were considered Peter's successors, and basically they exalted the bishops because the bishops kind of led them, basically. Next thing you have to know is Pope Leo the First. That's an important guy you have to know. So what ended up happening was the bishops of Rome were using the title of Papa, Father, which in English it just translates to Pope. So basically it just means father. It means like the patriarchy, the father, the household, the father of the household. But in this case, it's the father of the church, so the Pope. So Pope Leo I was especially energetic in systemically expounding the doctrine of Patrine supremacy. He portrayed himself as an heir of St. Peter. And he was the head of the Christian church. He's also very well known for stopping the advance of Attila the Hun. So he's known as basically Attila the Hun is they come from the east, and they were going to attack all of Italy, and they were actually going to conquer Italy. But according to the box on page 189, basically what happened was Pope Leo confronted Attila the Hun in a peaceful meeting, and supposedly what ended up happening was the apostles Peter and Paul ended up being stood before Attila the Hun and basically threatened him, and that's what ended up happening.
I drank your Chick-fil-A.
Okay. Alright, I'm making a video, so if you could just... Cool. Awesome.
I love you, Mom!
Stop. It's a YouTube video. Alright. Anyways, sorry for that. It's my roommate. I'm in my room today and not the practice room because it's being occupied. So, anyways. So continuing on. So Leo I. So that's what he basically did. He was the first great pope that ended up happening. They built churches and influenced the structure of the church's organization. And they also became involved in church government and doctrinal controversies. Yeah, so the Pope was very important in that regard. So he stopped the Attila the Hun, and then he started basically the Roman Catholic Church. And so the next term you have to know is Pope Gelasius, or Gelasius. That's on page 190. So he was the Pope after this in 492 to 496. He wrote to the Emperor at Constantinople. According to Gelasius, there were two ruling powers, spiritual and temporal, with different functions. The church was ultimately the higher authority because all men, including emperors, must look to the church for means of salvation. So there's church, and then there's the emperor, there's the Pope and the emperor. So what he believed was that the Pope was overall higher than the emperor, just because of the fact that, the higher authority should be the church instead of the state or instead of the government. So that's what he did. That was his opinion on the matter. And then the next guy you have to know is Pope Gregory I. So in the 6th century, a strong Pope, Gregory I, known as Gregory the Great, was the last of the Latin fathers, so the last of the church fathers. So he had enabled the church in the 7th and 8th centuries to play an increasingly prominent role in civilizing the Germans and aiding the emergence of a distinctly new European civilization. So the Roman Church was spreading throughout the area in Europe, so it ended up going into the Germans, in the Germanic tribes, and Pope Gregory I was one of the reasons why. He took charge and made Rome and the surrounding area into an administrative unit that eventually came to be known as the Papal States, the PAPL states, so Papal States. This is all found on page 190. He established a government for Rome and fed the people. Like, that was his main goal. He remained loyal to the empire and continued to address the Byzantine Empire as the rightful ruler of Italy. But yeah, basically he kind of connected like the church and the state. He kind of connected the church with the government that was going on at this time. And that's what Pope Gregory was known for. He's one of the most important popes of the Middle Ages. He had a lot of numerous writings. He is considered the last of the Latin fathers of the church. So yeah, he's very important. And then the next thing, as I told you, we are going to get into monks and nuns. So the next term that you have to know is monks and what monasticism is. So the monks basically literally translates someone who lives alone. So when you think of a monk, you think of someone who literally is like, by himself. I think of the Chinese monks really, but like those are like the people in orange robes and bald, and they just like are by themselves. But nowadays they're usually in a community. So community of monks. But what ended up happening was someone who lives alone is basically a man who sought to live a life divorced from the world. So he cut off all human society. That was what they did back then. And then Christian monasticism, which developed first in Egypt, was initially based on the model of the solitary hermit. So hermit, again, someone who lives alone, who forsakes all civilized society. So a couple people were famous for this. You don't have to know them, but St. Anthony was one of these people. He took what Jesus said to Mark, that you should sell whatever you have, give to the poor, and you shall treasure in heaven, and come take up the cross and follow me. He sold all his land, and to pursue his ideal of holiness, he basically was like poor the rest of his life. Saint Simeon the Stylite, he lived 3 decades in a basket atop a pillar, more than 60 feet high. So he literally separated himself physically from everyone else. These early monks, however, soon found themselves unable to live in solitude. So what ended up happening, like, you need human connection, even if you're like a devout monk. So what ends up happening was monasticism. So yeah, it's the model. So monasticism, which you have to know, is it was based on the model of the solitary hermit who forsakes all civilized society to pursue spirituality. And then later on, the next term you have to know, the guy is Saint Bernadette of Nursia. And he founded a monastic house and wrote a set of rules for it sometime between 520 and 530. So basically, he established a form of monastic life in the Western Christian Church, and this is when basically there was a bunch of monks living together. What you think of now in the Roman Catholic Church, you think of monks living together. So it was a monastery. That's where they lived, and they basically were being obedient. They were praying a lot. Benedict's rules, what you have to know about him, he divided each day into a series of activities. They believed a hard emphasis on prayer and manual labor. So they prayed a lot, and they had a lot of manual work hours. So basically they believed it was for glorifying God. That was like one of the best ways to do it. Monks ate, worked, slept, and worshipped together. This is the Benedict. That's what Saint Benedict became known for. The Benedictine monastery was strictly ruled by an abbot or a father of the monastery, so it was basically like the father, and like the monks believed everything he said, basically, no matter what it was. So they lived in poverty, but they still were in a monastery, so they still like supported themselves, so they probably had gardens and stuff. Women too ended up doing this, such as the nuns. So the nuns basically lived the same exact life, except they were doing it as women, and they were in. Sometimes later on, there was double monasteries allowing monks and nuns to reside close by, but they were still practicing celibacy, so they would not, have any sexual relations with each other. They would just basically like pray together and work together. Then the last term you have to know is St. Patrick, and yes, this is where St. Patrick's Day ended up coming from, but not really because of anything relating to pinching someone because you're green, or because they're not wearing green, whatever it is. But he was a saint during this time. He's actually a very profound, famous saint in Ireland, so he does come from Ireland. But basically what happened was he became a monk, and then he chose to return to Ireland to convert the Irish to Christianity. So he was the founder of Irish Christianity. So a couple things that were different, because it wasn't connected to Europe, because Ireland is an island next to Great Britain. So they did not have like all the bishops that the Roman Catholic Church had. The Irish monasticism was basically more focusing on monks and monasteries. That's a couple important things you have to know. So instead of bishops, he basically believed monks in the monasteries led the church, and it flourished, and it was very important for the Irish people. And a couple other things later on that you just might want to know. England ended up doing similar stuff. They mixed Irish and Roman Catholicism into one. So they still believed in monasteries and monks, but they also believed in a bishop. Let's see. Yeah, so basically, like, they had a couple of differences between, but in Britain, Roman Christianity encountered Irish Christianity, and it basically, like, kind of mixed. They had a couple arguments, but they basically, like, took the best of both worlds. And the monks ended up traveling to, like, the Germanic tribes in Germany to try and convert people, and they ended up converting a couple, but a couple of the people ended up dying because they tried to convert people that didn't want anything to do with Christianity. Again, monasteries with women and men were allowed. Monks and nuns were together. Let's see. One of the most important ones was Saint Hilda. She founded a monastery of Whitby. You don't have to know her, but she founded a monastery. She ended up, 5 future bishops ended up coming from that monastery that she was at. Yeah, nuns were actually a lot more actually respected back then, I guess. They're still respected now because like women's rights and everything and feminism, but it was just like they worked closely with the monks, so they were considered just as Christ-like as the monks. Again, the most important thing is they practiced celibacy. They did not have any sexual relations with anyone. They basically were just they believed in keeping themselves as virgins and not marrying anyone, so they stayed single for their entire life. So I'm just going to go over everything one more time so that way you guys get it. Again, these videos are becoming a little bit shorter just because I'm starting to get used to the YouTube videos. It's coming easier now. I read the chapter basically and then I just present on it. Again, if you want 12:30 to 1 on Monday, Wednesday, Fridays will be my in-person lectures. I will probably be trying to have a lecture this weekend, this Saturday on October 30th in the afternoon, an in-person, most likely 1 to 1.5 hour lecture for Unit 3. If you're interested in that, please let me know. Reach out through my Instagram. It's Grantwood2003 or anything like that. Besides that, I have a Unit 3 test next Monday, which is November 1st, so I'm trying to get prepared for that. But yeah, so I'm going to go over this stuff one more time. So Augustine. He was the most prominent of the Latin fathers. He was the first one. He had 2 major works, Confessions and the City of God. Confessions talking about basically how he struggled throughout his early life to find God, and